to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson. Thousands of women and children have made attempts to reach the European Union by entering Poland in recent weeks. As a migration crisis that began in August escalates, crowds of people are now stranded between the border that separates Belarus and Poland. They traveled to Minsk, the Belarusian capital, on a promise that they would be able to breach the fence and enter the EU country. Charlotte MacDonald-Gibson, veteran journalist and author of Castaway, True Stories of Survival from Europe's Refugee Crisis, has been on the front lines of Europe's migration crisis over the past decade. She joins us to help explain how immigration policy in the EU led to this conflict and gives leverage to authoritarian regimes. Charlotte MacDonald-Gibson, welcome to Feminism Today.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Sophia.
The refugee crisis is the biggest moral challenge since the Second World War, giving authoritarian states what you describe as a roadmap to blackmail. Do you have an opinion on the EU's response to the Polish-Belarus crisis? Can you give us some context here?
Well, certainly the greatest share of the blame for the humanitarian crisis that we've seen on the Belarus-Poland border is with the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, in retaliation for EU sanctions against his regime, which were put in place after widely discredited elections and other authoritarian measures. After the EU put these sanctions in place, he was looking for a way to get them back, essentially. And he had a very good idea, and he wasn't the first one to have it, which was to threaten the EU with migrants. Now, this seems like a very dehumanizing thing to do. How can you threaten a country, a bloc with people? And it really shouldn't be the case. People searching for a better life should not be used in this manner, of course. But the problem was that this has been done before. The European Union, since the refugee crisis that we'll all recall in 2015, when the Syrian civil war sent more than 1 million people on the path to Europe, since that year, the border policies, the reception conditions in Europe and the European Union have become harsher and harsher towards people seeking asylum, people seeking a better life. And we've heard increasingly dehumanizing language towards these people and policies which frankly put people's lives and their safeties and the lives and safeties of their families at risk. And this includes policies to push people back at sea. So if people go out to sea in small boats to try and reach the European Union waters, they're often pushed back to where they came from, often in dangerous circumstances. So this has been the increasing policy of the European Union, was this really security-focused policy. And a lot of the more, let's say, unsavory regimes along the border with the European Union have noticed this fear and panic that the EU has about migration and about more people coming to its shores, and has used this. Turkey is the most obvious example, because in 2016, the European Union promised to give Turkey around 6 billion euros in exchange for them stopping people leaving Turkish soil and trying to head into the European Union. Right. Now, that deal was controversial at the time, but it did lessen the amount of people trying to make that journey. However, now, whenever the European Union tries to censure Turkey or speak out about rule of law or human rights abuses or freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the Turkish government threatens to scrap the deal and saying, and they will use this dehumanizing language, we will flood Europe with migrants again. So we see this again and again, and other countries have done this too. Morocco being another example. Earlier this year, after the Moroccan government were upset that the Spanish had given medical treatment to a separatist group in the Moroccan territory, they stopped policing the border with the Spanish enclave in Morocco, and again used migrants as a political pawn. So this is the context which the Belarusian leader had when he decided to do the same thing. I would say he took it a step further than the other countries, though, because all the evidence points to the fact that his state apparatus had actually facilitated those journeys. So it helped people fly from countries which are experiencing turmoil into the Belarusian capital, and then literally accompany people to that border with Poland to make this threat essentially to the European Union. And this is where we ended up with this terrible humanitarian crisis, with kids on the ground, the freezing cold, with the snow coming, really, really tragic scenes in which at least 11 people have died, including a 1-year-old baby. So this is how we got to this point. But of course, it isn't just Belarus. The European Union is to blame too, because it's their policies, it's their panic, it's their fear in the face of this completely manageable issue of migration and asylum that has encouraged dictators like Lukashenko to take these actions.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about it. You touched on it a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about women refugees. Some hospitalized, some have miscarried, separated from their children, as you pointed out. What are some of the impossible decisions that women migrants have to make on the ground and in the field?
Well, again, this comes down to the policies that European countries have enacted over the years to try and keep the numbers of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants down. Let's use the example of the United Kingdom, for example. If a child arrives in the United Kingdom alone, their parents cannot apply to join that child. The family reunification policies don't allow that to happen. So imagine you're a mother and your child's in another country. Would you get on a dangerous boat to go and find that child, to try and find a way to get to that child? Absolutely you would. You would take any risk you can to be reunited with your child. Mm-hmm. So these are the kind of decisions that European Union, obviously Britain isn't in the European Union, but European Union and European government policy is forcing people to make.
Right. Your book, Castaway, is really one of the first works of narrative nonfiction on the ongoing refugee crisis and the civil war in Syria, in particular, describing the agonizing stories of migrants. There's a pregnant Eritrean woman. There's a father from Greece who's struggling with whether or not he should sort of take this journey. What makes a person risk life and limb to reach Europe's shores? What are some of the incentives of sort of living and being in this space?
Well, I think that is something that is really crucial for all governments to try and understand. And I don't think people make that effort to do that. I say governments, but also the media and anybody who has an interest in trying to bring down the levels of death and suffering we see among people trying to migrate today. And it's a complex set of reasons why anybody leaves their home. There can be a very one-dimensional idea in many countries, like, oh, well, they're coming here, people are coming here because they want benefits, or they want to take these jobs, or they want this better quality of life. And these very simplistic reasons are given, and they seep into the consciousness of the population when they're very, very far from the complex, truthful nuances that contribute to somebody making that decision. I think what was really telling in when I was researching my book was not one of the 5 people that I profiled who came to Europe wanted to come to Europe in the first place. For example, the 3 Syrians, most of them wanted to stay in neighboring countries. They wanted to stay close to their home. They wanted to stay within similar culture, similar environment. And so, for example, a lot of people tried to make their life in Lebanon, which is obviously just next door to Syria. But over the years, support to the refugee populations in Syria, in Lebanon, in other neighboring countries and nearby countries like Jordan, that support decreased. People's kids couldn't have access to school. They didn't have access to healthcare. They couldn't get jobs. So then they were forced to move again. So we see that it's not just that somebody wants to leave their country and come to Europe because it's the easy thing to do. It's a number of events that will happen over a number of years that will force people to make these decisions, and to think that the changing one thing, like, stopping people getting on a boat, will change those fundamental underlying issues is very naive, I think.
Let's talk a little bit more about the book. I'm curious how you happened upon this story and what EU countries actually do at this point to help.
With regards to the book, I've been working on refugee migration issues for a few years before what we call the crisis of 2015. So some of the people in the book I'd met during the course of my reporting, other people I had got in contact with via NGOs or humanitarian organizations, because I really wanted to tell different aspects of the crisis. And you brought up before the case of Sina, the young woman from Eritrea, who traveled from Turkey to Greece when she was 9 months pregnant. And for me, that story was a really important one to tell, because I myself was pregnant when I was working on the book. And she and we gave birth to our sons within a few weeks of each other.
Oh.
And for me at the time, I found it really difficult to be able to put myself in somebody's shoes, to feel that they had to get on a boat when they were carrying a child and all the risks that entailed. So for me, it was so important to find that story so I could understand that, and I could portray the desperation and the various factors that make you feel that that is the safest thing you can do for your baby, for your child, because essentially that's why everybody is doing it. They think it's the safest, most beneficial thing they can do for themselves and the people that they love. And I think that's very hard to understand unless you really spend time getting to know people who've lived through these kind of situations.
Very good. So you recently finished your second book, right? So two things I wanted to sort of before we wrap up. I want to talk about your TED Talks. I really found that very compelling. But I also read recently that you recently finished up your second book, An Examination of the Causes of Extremism, told through the eyes of people who have been drawn to radical groups. What can readers come to expect from this new publication? What type of research went into this project?
Well, in a way, there's a similarity there between the book about refugees that I wrote and this book about extremism, because I feel that at the moment, there seems to be a real inability to see the world through somebody else's eyes. We are very much reduced to one-dimensional ideas of what a person is and why they do what they do. And this is what I wanted to do with Castaway, was to really involve somebody in these stories, really put people in somebody else's shoes to understand the reasons why they made the decisions they made. And I wanted to do something similar with the issue of extremism, because again, it's an issue where everything is reduced to very dehumanizing, one-dimensional caricatures. And I wanted to see if I could make people understand the process by which somebody is attracted to extreme beliefs. Because I truly believe that unless we understand the motivations people have for doing what they do, and whether these things are good or whether these things are bad or somewhere in the middle, we have to understand what those motivations are if we have any hope of coming up with policy decisions which are going to help with the situation, whether that be tackling extremism or whether that be assisting refugees and people seeking asylum find a better life. We have to understand why people do what they do in the first place.
Now, on your TED Talk, viewers can certainly go online and do a search and sort of watch the talk. But I found it really very compelling. And I wonder, what are some of the key takeaways? I mean, one of the important things that you bring up is you start where you are, you do what you can. Tell us a little bit about the TED Talk and how that came together.
Well, that came after the refugee, my book on refugees came out, after Castaway came out. And I think it resonated with a lot of people. And certainly when I did my book tour and spoke to a lot of people in events, there was this feeling of helplessness, of hopelessness in a way, because people were doing what they could, but it didn't seem to make any difference. It was amazing what a big outswelling of support there was for refugees during the crisis. I mean, there were so many Facebook groups and community groups that organically evolved to try and assist people who were in difficulties and were trying to search for a better life. But a lot of this didn't get much media coverage. And instead we saw over the years that the media coverage became more dehumanizing, became more combative, more security driven. It just lacked and lost that empathy. So I certainly found that when I talked about the book, people felt despondent. Like, we did what we can, but this isn't reflected in the policy we see our government's making. This isn't reflected in the stories we read in the media. And I understood that despondency, because I feel that despondency as well. Because certainly when I wrote the book, I was really hoping so people would see things in a different light, would really understand that we're all essentially the same. We have the same motivations in our lives. And it just felt like the public discourse went in the other direction. So I understood this despondency. But what I was trying to say with the TED Talk is you never know what actions you have, what consequences those actions will have. And even if you don't see the consequences of the actions you take immediately, you never know what those consequences will be in the long run. And as I said in the talk, a few people read the book and said to me, now I see that we're all the same. people who are seeking a different life. They're just the same as me. We have the same hopes and dreams and goals. And the fact that just a few people, that maybe I changed the minds of a few people, I mean, that I realized in the end that could mean something, that really did mean something, that we don't have to try and change everyone's minds and completely turn the world around overnight, because that's not possible. And if we have these unachievable goals, then we won't think about the small things. But we have to think that the small things matter, and the small things do matter.
For more on the complex development challenges and the economic conditions driving the policy decisions of government, as well as the personal dilemmas, pressures, and choices for the socially displaced, we are joined now by Zahra Moulvi, who, for more than a decade, has been promoting gender equality and the protection of human rights in the Philippines and Pakistan, most recently collecting and evaluating data in Pakistan for the United Nations Development Program, or the UNDP. Zahra Moulvi, welcome to the program.
Hi, Sophia. Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome. Now, poverty is obviously a multidimensional issue. Can you help us understand how people are affected by poverty in the countries where you've worked, in the Philippines and Pakistan, for example? Who are the poor and where do they live?
Poverty exists in different pockets, as you mentioned, in both these countries that I've worked and where I live currently in Pakistan. It's unfortunately a widespread issue which impacts access to basic services, which unfortunately those who have access to those basic services like health or education often take it for granted. But poverty is impacted by the income that these people receive on a daily basis, where they choose to spend that income or the opportunities they have to spend that income. And poverty impacts almost every aspect of their lives. One of the ways that women are affected by poverty is often referred to as the feminization of poverty, because a lot of the mobility issues that impact women who live in certain areas or hard to reach or inaccessible sort of locations in different parts of these countries often face far more challenges than their counterparts, than their male counterparts.
I see. Now, you currently work along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, collecting and evaluating data in the KP province, the Northwest frontier. What are some of the intractable problems, the administrative and capacity challenges of the 5 million or so residents of the former tribal areas?
Right. Thank you for that. There are so many, primarily because of the long history of this area. It has been a particularly complex environment where the governance systems or the administrative systems that you see in the rest of the country do not exist and have not existed for many, many years. And only recently, I think it's just been a few years now, since they were formally introduced as per a constitutional amendment in Pakistan as a formal province, which means that now governance systems can formally be introduced in that area, and you can finally do away with the colonial system, which was called the Frontier Crimes Regulation. So to answer your question, they are extremely fledgling. They are at the very, very basic level of institutional development. The tribal structure is very different from the rest of the country. And formal administrative systems are only just starting to show at the district level in these areas.
I see. Thank you for that. Now, let's move the conversation a little bit forward to women's rights in particular. Women's access to justice has increased dramatically over the past decade, but sizable investment is really needed to make legal institutions more gender sensitive in parts of the world. What does this issue look like in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region? You touched on it a little bit, but specifically, what does the data tell us? Any recommendations to address the issues?
Absolutely. I think one of the very first step that people can take is to ask the women themselves. So you really need to go into these areas. You have to speak to the women from that area instead of assuming that they are for or against a particular system of justice. And because it embodies so much more than just sort of a cultural setup. It embodies a long history of attaining justice in a more collective system of ensuring that the people who want justice get it. So yes, there is a sense of anticipation that a formal justice system is going to be good for the people of that area, but there's also a lot of trepidation that it may be far more cumbersome, far more bureaucratic than the traditional way of attaining justice, which is through a tribal community sort of group led by a leader, in which women may or may not get the justice that they deserve, but in the sense that it's speedy. So it's a complex issue, but I think for women, they are looking forward to a more formal system where they can access in a more objective fashion, perhaps.
Sure.
But they're also definitely concerned about how that will impact their traditional family setup and the way they are used to obtaining justice in their cultural tradition.
So what do women want in that region? What do women want in Afghanistan and Pakistan? I spent some time early in my academic career in South Asia, and I know that what women want, as we've talked about before, in New York, in terms of feminist liberation and independence, is not what is wanted. It's very unique to different spaces. So what do women want? What is the data showing us?
The data is showing us that women are very much concerned with their economic environment. They are very much concerned with how they live, where they live, what is their basic quality of life. Pretty much the same concerns that the men of their family have. So, to say that they are in opposition to what, say, the male household, the main household leader is demanding from, say, people in the power or the government, women echo those same sentiments. They don't want something different. They want the prosperity of their families. They want their men to be safe. They want their health to be priority. They want to be able to access utilities that are basic sort of human rights, which is access to electricity, access to food, access to clean water. So in a way, when we talk about rights, they're talking about basic human rights, regardless of gender. And for women, they very much see themselves as part of a unit. They do not see themselves as holding something that's controversial in a way, like that's completely different from, say, what men want or what other people assume that they want. They first and foremost want stability and prosperity for themselves, their menfolk, and their communities.
I see. Let's talk a little bit about the equitable access to education. The context is different, as we've been talking for the past couple of minutes, in every country. How do we navigate the barriers to access, and what works in the field?
Education is a sector very close to my heart since I launched my career, so to speak. I worked for 5 years in education, particularly for young girls and boys, primary education, and also looking at how communities can be actively involved in ensuring that they demand good quality education from the service providers. And if we talk about, if you sort of focus on the barriers to education for women particularly, there are two main things that stand out in the field and in these areas that are in dire need of it. Number one is transportation. A lot of these areas that are isolated or in far-flung areas, going to school is a pretty long, cumbersome process. You have to go through broken roads, or they have to go through a lot of daily. These are conditions that people who get into a car and just go to school or who take a bus, they can't even fathom. So for them, transportation is the number one priority, and particularly with regards to security. So if they are to travel by foot, or they are taking, say, a public transport system arranged by the government, are they safe? Is it according to a cultural norm where they are being accompanied by a sort of male member, maybe, perhaps? So for them, that's number one is very important. Number two, of course, is the presence of latrines in schools, particularly for girls' schools. Very important. In these areas where girls and women are taking a much higher risk in leaving the four walls of their houses to go to schools and to get an education, it's very important that they feel that their privacy is protected that their dignity is protected, and presence of latrines on campus is a very, very important consideration.
I see. I took some time to sort of do a search. I participated in the International Women's March last year in Washington, D.C., and I wonder about what's happening in that space in terms of women's engagement in the global movement towards liberation and sort of their engagement in the feminist discourse. And I recognize that there was some engagement in Pakistan last year. Can you tell us a little bit about how women are engaging the global agenda for feminism?
Sure. I think that looks a little bit different depending on which part of Pakistan you are speaking about, right? It'll look a bit different in the cities, in the more settled districts, vis-a-vis villages and vis-a-vis less urban areas. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is that for women all over the country, they have been participating in very active social participation in issues that impact them and their communities at large. And we've had that before. I think Pakistan has seen waves of women coming out on the street in different forms. And we're seeing it now as well, in which women are coming out to speak about against violence against women, which unfortunately does not seem to have a downward trend. So in urban areas, you're seeing women come out on the streets more, but people in communities, women in villages have been doing this sort of activism or feminism for so many years. People like me, or women like me in urban cities are actually now also venturing out in groups to be much more vocal and to speak about things that anger us, to speak about what is a direct affront to women's dignity in a lot of issues that happen as they occur. So a lot of real-time reaction. So
very encouraging. Now to the future of development. And international development at that. No country has yet achieved the combination of high human development with a light ecological footprint. It's difficult to deny at this point both the impact of climate change and, for example, the global pandemic. Where do we go from here in terms of research, evaluation, and importantly, advocacy?
Climate change affects each and every one of us, no matter where we live. But yes, poorer countries, poorer communities bear that burden in far more grave and more immediate ways. And I think part of each and everything we do, it's a footprint of every single decision we make on a daily basis, on every program we run, whether it is for economic empowerment, whether it's for education, whether it's for building roads, what have you. So I think the conversation needs to be very much integrated as part of our daily life and as part of the agenda in a social and development agenda for every sector. So the recognition of that is extremely important, and it needs to be on the agenda for everyone who is trying to do anything for development, really.
Zahra Moulvi, thank you so much for joining us this week. And that's it for our program. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Twitter. Thanks so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.